Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Ford. I am a pediatric psychologist at the Children's Hospital, and I am going to be speaking at the Play, Eat, Learn series at the Mississippi Children's Museum, talking a little bit about sleep in young children. And we're going to spend our time learning a little bit about sleep, how sleep works across development, healthy sleep habits that you can all do to help support your kids, and then talking a little bit about some of the common behavioral sleep problems that we see in children and adolescents. All right, thank you all for joining me today. I'm excited to be here at Play, Eat, Learn and talking to y'all about one of my favorite topics, which is pediatric sleep. And my name is Hannah Ford. I am a pediatric psychologist at UMMC's Center for Advancement of Youth, or the K Clinic as we like to call it. And I work with kids presenting with a lot of different issues at K, but I do have some specialized training in behavioral sleep medicine and used to work in a sleep clinic. So it's something I really enjoy doing. And I have over 10 years of experience working with kids, adolescents, and young adults. So we're going to be talking a lot today about sleep. We're going to spend a little bit of time doing some science talk, learning a little bit about how sleep works, why it's important. We're going to talk about how sleep changes over the course of development. And then we're going to talk about some healthy sleep habits that you can implement at home to help support your kids to have the best sleep possible. And then we're going to touch on some common sleep problems that we see specifically in young children that are often amenable to some changes you guys can make at home. And we'll talk a little bit about some resources that can be helpful as well. So like I said, we're going to do a little bit of learning here at the beginning. We'll try to not get into too much science, but I think it's important to talk a little bit about how sleep works so you guys will understand why I'm making some of these weird recommendations that I'm going to make. So starting off, what is sleep? This is actually a surprisingly difficult thing to define. At its most basic, sleep is really an altered state of consciousness where we have reduced levels of arousal, we're less responsive to our environment, we have less motor movement, but during most of sleep, our brain is actually really active, and at some points of sleep, it's just as active as it is when we are awake. So when we talk about sleep, we will often talk about the structure of our sleep, or what we call the sleep architecture. So these are the different stages that our brains go through when we sleep at night. So there are we used to say 4 stages of non-REM sleep, followed by what we call a REM period. And so we start off, all of us, when we go to sleep at night, in stage 1. This is really when we're just transitioning to falling asleep. This lasts just a few minutes. During this stage, our body is not fully relaxed. There's only some minor changes in brain activity, and it's super easy to wake you up during that time. So if I were to call your name, you would kind of jump up and wake up. Stage 2 is what we kind of consider the start of our true sleep. So our muscles start to relax, our breathing slows down, our heart rate slows down, and we start to see some characteristic changes in brain activity during this time, where the overall activity of the brain slows, but we see these kind of short bursts or spikes of activity. Then we have stage 3. We used to call it 3 and 4, but we have kind of decided this is one and the same. This is our deep sleep. So this is when we have really low muscle tone, heart rate, breathing decreases even further. It's really hard to wake someone up during this stage. Your brain activity during this period shows some characteristic patterns called delta waves, which we also call slow waves. And then finally, this is followed by a period of REM. So REM is what we typically know as our dream sleep, although dreams can actually occur at any stage of your sleep. They just are more common and tend to be more vivid during REM. During REM, your brain activity actually picks up and is really similar to the levels when you're awake. We have atonia, which is paralysis of your muscles with the exception of our eyes. And we have a lot of rapid eye movement during this period of our sleep. So just as kind of a visual representation of what this looks like, this is kind of a typical, what we call a hypnogram that shows how we proceed through these stages at night. And this actually shows some differences in our sleep architecture over age. So starting at the top here, we have young children. So think about that as kind of like school-aged kids, young adults, and then elderly folks. And so looking up top at our kiddos first, so you can see we have this period when we go to bed where we're awake, and then they drop down to that stage 1 sleep, followed by 2, and then 3 and 4. That's your slow wave sleep. And then we're going to kind of progress back out of that. So back to 2, and then we enter that period of REM. So that's our dream sleep, followed by a brief awakening, and then so on and so forth. What you guys might notice is at the beginning of our night, we tend to have a lot of that deep sleep, that slow wave sleep, and our REM period is very short. Over the course of the night, we start to have less of that slow wave sleep and longer periods of REM. Obviously, you can see this changes a little bit as we go through development. So this chart looks a little bit intimidating, but this is sleep. This is what it is. So when we talk about how sleep works, we tend to talk about the two-process model of sleep. So all sleep is the way that these kind of two processes interact with one another. And I'll start with this one on top because I think it's a little bit more straightforward. So this is what we call process S, or your homeostatic sleep drive. That's a lot to say, so I just call it sleep pressure. This is pretty easy to understand. So sleep pressure is, at its root, kind of the buildup of pressure over the time that you're awake that makes you feel sleepy. So what's happening in your brain is all of these kind of sleepy chemicals are getting released. The longer they're getting released, the more they build up, the more tired you feel. These sleepy chemicals can only be produced when you're awake, right? So the longer you're awake, the sleepier you're gonna be. This sleep pressure actually builds more quickly in infants and young children than it does in adults. That being said, you guys all know there becomes a certain period where kids develop kind of the biological maturity to fight sleep, regardless of how tired they are. They can make a choice to engage in an activity other than sleep. This bottom process here is what we call your endogenous circadian rhythm. This is kind of like your body's internal clock, your 24-hour clock. On this chart, higher kind of markers down here indicate more alertness or more wakefulness. So we tend to have two periods of maximum alertness. That's where these hashes are higher, right? So that tends to be mid-morning, and then also the evening, also known as your second wind, right? And then we have two kind of troughs where we tend to be least alerting. So usually right after, in the early afternoon, or kind of like 3 to 5-ish. That's not just because we ate too much food at lunch or had Chick-fil-A, right? That's actually a circadian thing. And then usually the next kind of trough is late in the night, so like between 3 and 5 o'clock in the morning. So if you try to wake someone up during that time, it's usually really, really difficult. So our levels of sleepiness or alertness at any given time are determined by the duration and quality of your previous sleep and the time since your last sleep, so that sleep pressure, and how that interacts with our sleep clock. Sleep is most likely to happen when we have built up sufficient sleep drive at a time that our circadian clock thinks we should be tired. Obviously, there are going to be factors that impact this, right? This does not look like everyone's sleep schedule out there. So I think the easiest one to think about is with our sleep drive, right? So there's a lot of things that are going to impact that. For example, if, like many of our teens love to do, you come home in the afternoon and you take a big old nap until 6 p.m., you're going to burn off a lot of those sleepy chemicals, and it's going to take way longer for that to build back up. Same thing, I'm gonna throw our teenagers under the bus again. If you stay up late on Friday and then you sleep until 1 o'clock on Saturday, it's gonna take a long time for those chemicals to build up and make us tired, right? Sleep clock, or your circadian rhythm, is a little bit more nuanced. For humans, our natural internal clock is actually a little bit over 24 hours, and so the way that we are able to kind of stick to our 24-hour schedule are through something that we call Zeitgebers. Zeitgebers are German for time giver. So you can think of these as just kind of cues from the environment that help your brain and body sort of stay on track with timing. Probably the most important Zeitgeber for humans in sleep is our light and dark schedule, right? But there's others, so things like exercise, the last time you ate. A big one that we're going to kind of touch on again and again is inconsistent sleep schedules can really mess with your circadian clock. So let's talk a little bit about how this changes across development. So we see a lot of different changes. You guys could see some of those kind of in the hypnogram there, but overall we see a gradual decline in the amount of sleep that we get in a 24-hour period over the lifespan. In young kids, this usually comes in the form of sleep consolidation. So they start to sleep less during the day and then sleep more at night in hopefully one big chunk. And then we also see changes to that architecture, right? So the length of our sleep cycles is different. So that's how long it takes you to go to 1, 2, 3, 4 REM. In infants, it's about 50 minutes. And then as kids enter into like preschool age, this lengthens to about 90 minutes, which is fairly consistent with adult cycles. The distribution of our sleep changes, so the amount of REM or dream sleep that you get declines over the course of childhood. So for our infants, like half their sleep is REM. This declines to 25 and then 30% from early childhood and then into adulthood. And then similarly, we see changes in that slow wave sleep also. So the amount of slow wave sleep tends to peak in early childhood and then drops off pretty quickly after puberty and then continues to decrease. That slow wave sleep is super important for our growth. And so as you can imagine, that's a time when our kids are, really growing pretty quickly. We also see shifts in timing. So we kind of touched on this, but starting in middle childhood, you start to see this trend of wanting to go to sleep later in the evening and then sleep later in the morning. That's just not just our teens being difficult, that's a biological change that is happening in their body. That shift really accelerates in adolescence. Because of that, you also start to see a lot more irregularity in those sleep-wake timings, those patterns. So teens especially start to have a much bigger discrepancy between their school night bed and wake times and weekend bed and wake times. I'm going to touch briefly on recommendations for sleep duration, and I put this up here because these are any recommendation in terms of sleep hours is going to be based on averages, right? And so you can have a really, really big variability within those numbers that can still be normal and still be okay. So sometimes families see these numbers and they get really stressed about them, but I want you guys to remember that there's a lot of variability within that can be normal. So with that caution in place, these are the recommendations from the National Sleep Foundation. So the dark blue here is recommended, and then the kind of teal color is also noted as may be appropriate. So you can see also, especially in younger childhood, that span is a lot bigger. So there is a lot of variability during those ages. So I think if you can see here, newborns is anything from 11 to 19 hours. So that's like a huge spectrum of what's considered normal. And even outside of those ranges, everybody kind of has their own sleep need where they feel best and most rested. So even if your child does not perfectly fall in one of these, it doesn't necessarily mean anything is wrong, but this is kind of what we're aiming for. So with all that said, let's talk about why sleep is important. Why are we talking about this topic? Why does this matter? I think it's kind of makes sense to start with, why do we sleep? And the honest answer is we don't really know. A lot of our understanding about sleep comes from research studies where we deprive people of sleep or we stop them from entering certain types of sleep like REM or deep sleep, and then we look at all the bad things that happen to them, right? So even if we don't totally know why we sleep, we do know it's super duper important. Some of the things we know it's essential for are just your body's physical recovery. So not just rest, your cells are super active during sleep. They undergo a lot of regeneration. For kids, most of your growth happens during sleep. Sleep affects literally every single tissue in our body. We also know that sleep is really, really important for memory and learning. So we believe that memory consolidation occurs during sleep. And then finally, sleep supports a healthy immune system. Just for example, cytokines, which are a type of protein that helps your immune system fight off infection, those are produced more during sleep. So part of the reason we feel so tired when we're sick is because your body wants you to sleep, because that's when it does its healing. So on the other end, what happens when we don't get good sleep? So poor sleep really affects every single system of our being. So from a health standpoint, we know that less sleep is related to increased rates of obesity. So there's studies that have shown that individuals who sleep less than 6 hours a night, adults, are 7.5 times more likely to have a higher BMI. And that's after you control for things like family history, physical activity, demographic factors. We also know obesity is associated with hypertension and cardiovascular events. It's also associated with impaired glucose tolerance, which is the precursor to diabetes. From a mood standpoint, I think we all here know that when you don't get a good night's sleep, we're not our best selves. So we tend to be a little more irritable, a little more grouchy. We also know that poor sleep is associated with increased rates of depression as well as anxiety. With anxiety, it's a little tricky. The data is a little unclear whether poor sleep is causing anxiety or anxiety is causing poor sleep, but they certainly affect each other. From a cognitive standpoint, we have impairments in memory, our ability to pay attention and focus, and our ability to sort of problem solve. On a behavioral level, we have problems with impulse control, so like my ability to think before I make choices. or act, and more risk-taking behaviors. Specifically for our teens, not getting enough sleep is associated with increased risky sexual behavior and a lot more driving accidents. And the data on how frequently our teenagers drive drowsy and have accidents is really disturbing. It's a really big problem. We also have issues with academic problems, so not just learning, but also chronic tardiness, especially our teenagers that just can't get up in the morning and get to school. So they get in trouble for being tardy, but they also miss those opportunities for learning. And then lastly, substance use. So in adults and teens, lower sleep duration has been associated with alcohol use of illicit drugs, and of course, stimulants that we use to help keep ourselves awake when we don't get enough sleep. I think the other thing to consider too is these problems are actually really, really common. So about 25 to 30% of kids and 40% of adolescents have trouble with sleep. And probably more importantly is most kids don't just outgrow these sleep problems. So Judith Owens and colleagues did a study with young kiddos and found that 84% of infants that their parents reported that they had problems with sleep continued to have issues with sleep 3 years later. So this wasn't something that just kind of sorted itself out. So with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about what are some things that we can all do to help support healthy sleep, our best sleep. And we're going to talk about these things in the context of kiddos, but they do apply to adults as well. And sometimes parents can be the best models for their kids. So if I could instill one thing in everyone's brain that's most important, it is to keep a consistent sleep-wake schedule. It's super important for managing that sleep pressure we talked about and keeping your circadian clock in line. So that includes setting and enforcing a consistent bedtime and wake time. Ideally, that should be no more than an hour different on weekdays and weekends. Now, sometimes this is really, really hard for our teenagers because schools start way too early and way earlier than they should start. But really, you should have your teenager up by 9 or 10 at the very, very latest. From a sleep standpoint, that's being real generous. Potentially even the harder part is it's really, really important to enforce that wake time regardless of the past night's sleep, especially for our teenagers. So if your teen makes the choice to stay up late playing Fortnite, they are doing that with the knowledge that their caregiver is still going to wake them up at 9 o'clock the next morning. They're just going to have a really rough day. This is super duper important for teens because they have that kind of natural biological shift. You would think 2 days of oversleep on the weekend, 2 is way less than the 5 days they got up for school. You would think that would be more powerful, but it's not. It's just not how sleep works. So 2 days can be enough to really set them off track. The other thing I think that's hard about this is you can set a bedtime, but we don't really control when we fall asleep. You can control when you wake up. And so you can use that wake up time to put pressure on us during the day to feel tired and be able to fall asleep earlier at night. And then the next one is for our younger kiddos, establishing an age-appropriate and consistent nap schedule, especially for kids that are kind of starting to age out of their nap, to make sure that that's not interfering with some of that sleep pressure buildup at night. I already mentioned that one of those big zeitgebers is light, right? So one of the other easy things we can do is to increase our exposure to light in the morning. You can basically think of light as setting your circadian clock for the day. So once you're exposed to light, things start moving and that 24-hour cycle kind of starts. So I always tell my families, have your kiddo sit next to the window while they eat breakfast, turn the lights on, open the blinds, all those things. On the other end, we want to limit our light exposure in the evening. So you guys probably all heard of melatonin. You've probably bought it at Kroger or Walgreens or something, right? So melatonin is a sleep hormone. We call it a chronobiotic. It does make us sleepy, but its bigger job is to actually regulate that circadian clock. And your body can only release melatonin in the darkness, like dark. So that is part of why your doctors always tell you to stay off your phone at night, turn off our electronics, things like that, so that your body can naturally release some of that melatonin. Also, just a couple basic things. We want to exercise regularly. That's important, but don't do it right before bed. Avoid big meals right before bed so your body isn't busy kind of digesting. A light snack can be good. Limit caffeine. caffeine has a really long half-life, so it takes a long time to work through our body. So we really want to limit those like in the 6 or so hours before bed, and just be careful. Sometimes caffeine is in sneaky stuff like chocolate, tea, things like that. I think it's really also important for our kids to make their sleep environment as comfortable for them as possible. So low noise, low light, cool temperatures, age-appropriate bedding, make it comfortable for them, make it their space. And then keep that bed only for sleep. So another kind of one of those light garbers that we talk about, our brain is really, really sensitive to cues from the environment around us when it comes to sleep. And so what we really, really want to help kids and adults do is really build that connection between bed and sleep. We want your brain to know what it's supposed to do when you get into bed at night. So for that reason, we want to avoid engaging in other activities like homework or virtual school in bed, and also try to avoid sleeping in other places than our bed. We also want to try to avoid using sleep as punishment. So I both mean like sending kid for a timeout on their bed, but I also mean telling kiddo that if they, didn't do something that night, they're going to have an early bedtime. That inadvertently sends the message to kids that sleep is bad, it's not fun, it's a thing we don't want to do. And I think we can all agree that we want our kids to go to sleep. We also want to reduce kind of stimulation at nighttime and encourage relaxation. So we talk about putting that phone down for light reasons, but this is another reason too. Like, it is stimulating to be scrolling through and watching videos and all those things. So we just kind of want to put those things down and relax. Also avoid any stressful activities like homework or working on a project right before bed. And then lastly, having a good bedtime routine. So bedtime routine is 3 to 5 activities that your child does every single night in the same order. And they should be kind of calming, relaxing. Ideally, the last activity should be in the bedroom, like reading a story, saying prayers, singing a song, whatever. This might seem kind of small or silly, but there is actually a ton of data to show that this makes a really big difference, right? I already mentioned how sensitive our sleep system is to those cues from the environment. This is a great cue. Your brain knows, I brush my teeth, I put on my jammies, we read a story, I sleep. It knows what to do next. But research studies have even shown that just implementing a consistent bedtime routine is associated with shorter sleep onset latency, so that's how long it takes us to fall asleep, fewer night wakings, longer sleep duration, and fewer parent-reported behavior problems for young kids. And that's with only adding in a bedtime routine. It's the only change. So let's say you've done all those things and we're still having some issues, some problems. So I want to talk about some common, what we call behavioral sleep problems in young kids. And when I'm talking about young kids here, we're really talking about like kind of the preschool, school age range here. We could do an entire talk on infants and sleep, or adolescents for that matter. One of the most common things that I hear are behavior problems at bedtime. It's 10 to 30% of toddlers and preschoolers have behavior issues at bedtime, and about 15% of kids in that school age, like 4 to 10 range. So these behavior problems can take a few different forms. So you could have a kiddo who will stall or refuse to kind of follow the bedtime routine. They won't put on their pajamas, or they'll go to the bathroom, but they don't brush their teeth. Some kiddos will make repeated requests after getting into bed. We call those curtain calls. Like, the play's over, the curtain comes down, we think it's done, and then the actors like come running back out for like one more song or something. Usually for kids, it's another potty, I need a drink, I need a snack, I need a hug, I want another story, right? We've heard all of them. Some kids will come out and say things like, I'm scared, or I don't feel well, despite having no apparent distress at all. Usually that's because they've learned that those types of things get a response from mom and dad. They usually have a little more empathetic reaction to feeling scared or not feeling well. And then lastly, we have kids who have like just tantrums or more argumentative behaviors at bedtime that don't necessarily usually have issues like that. So what are some of the things that contribute to this? Well, one of them is normal development. For toddlers and preschoolers especially, some stalling is part of their normal development. At this age, they start to become more independent. They also start to realize that other people in the house are awake when I have to go to bed. That's not fair. I have FOMO. Often at bedtime, we're also asking our kids to transition from something they really, really like to do, something that's fun, to doing something that is objectively boring, like laying awake in your bed, right? Why would I want to do that? Again, this is also true for older kids and adults. I would really love to stay up all night watching Housewives, but I know I'll feel really terrible in the morning and I won't be good at my job. So I make a choice to go to bed. Kids are not going to make that choice. They want to do what feels good right now. At the same time, like I mentioned, they also developed this ability to fight sleep, just like us. As part of development too, kids also develop a more active imagination, and this can lead to some common nighttime fears that we'll also talk about, like monsters and things like that. Another huge factor is the way that caregivers interact with their child at bedtime can actually play a really big role in behavior problems. One of the probably most common issues that we tend to see in clinic are when parents give inconsistent responses. So sometimes they say no, sometimes they say yes. If there is a chance kiddo might get what they want, they are always going to try. This can also lead to escalating behaviors. So I came out and I, asked mom for this thing and I didn't get it. So then I threw myself on the floor and I screamed and cried and hollered until she finally gave in. Oftentimes, understandably, parents will eventually give in. It's bedtime, kiddo's tired, parents tired, right? It's the hardest part of the day for everyone. It makes us even more likely than usual to give in to those kinds of behaviors. The problem is that the bigger the behavior is, the child learns that they just need to make it bigger to get a reaction, right? And so we accidentally kind of create even more problems going forward. And then lastly, even, the most well-meaning caregivers sometimes give a lot of attention and presence at bedtime, and then sometimes kids can kind of learn to rely on this in order to fall asleep and just have a hard time doing it on their own. This can also result in some other issues like kids waking up during the night or seeking out a parent in the middle of the night. And then finally, we also have those circadian and homeostatic factors. So sometimes you can have problems at night if kiddo just is not ready to go to bed. Their circadian clock is just telling them it's not time yet. It can be hard to sort of identify a delayed clock, but if kiddo's internal clock says they should go to bed at 9, it doesn't really matter when you put them into bed. That's when they're going to fall asleep. Another issue is that you could be trying to put your child to bed during that second wind that we mentioned. It's going to be really hard for them to fall asleep then as well. For both of these issues, it can be really helpful to kind of monitor sleep patterns over a period of time, especially looking at when you start to see those behavior issues crop up, how long it takes when you actually get them in bed, how long it takes them to fall asleep. If they're consistently having a late sleep onset, that suggests maybe a timing clock issue, whereas if the time they fall asleep can be variable, that suggests that maybe kiddo is just really overtired and that's why you're seeing some behaviors. And then transitioning of naps. So especially for kids between the ages of 3 and 5, there's a lot of variability in terms of when they kind of give up or lose their nap. Napping relieves that sleep pressure. It can make it more difficult to fall asleep at a traditional bedtime. So sometimes we have to adjust our bedtime on days that kids have naps. So some of the things that you can do at home, one of the easiest ones is a bedtime chart. You guys have probably seen this. A bedtime chart is just a chart that kind of outlines those steps of the bedtime routine. It can be really helpful for letting kids know what to expect each night. It can also be really helpful with keeping caregivers consistent, especially if you have multiple caregivers that are helping put kiddo to sleep. The chart I also like because it helps parents to set limits, so you can just kind of point at the chart and be like, I'm sorry, that's not what the chart says next, right? What does the chart say? So it kind of takes the blame off parents and kind of reduces some room for negotiation. Just blame the chart. Bedtime charts are really important for kids that have a hard time with transitions. So kids with ADHD or autism, for example. You can put visual symbols on here. So I don't know if you guys can see this. Maybe take a bath, brush your hair, put your jammies on. And that way even our young kids can kind of follow the schedule and know what to expect. And I always like when you make the chart, let the child be involved. We want them to feel like this is their chart and take some ownership over it. So let them, pick out the pictures, or if they want to make it Frozen themed or whatever they want to do, that kind of gives them some ownership over it. And then this also works great with positive reinforcement. So stickers, praise, rewards for completing the parts of our bedtime routine. A couple other kind of simple interventions that I really love. So something called the Bedtime Pass program. This works well with kind of our school age kids. So the way that this works is kiddo is provided with up to 3 passes during the night, and they can exchange this pass for a certain activity. Not anything, but something like a drink, a story, a hug. Each time that they use their pass, they have to give it to their caregiver, and the caregiver keeps it. If the child has any passes left on them in the morning, they can exchange it for something that they want, either like a prize or a preferred activity. So they are incentivized for staying in their bed and not using their passes. If they run out of passes and they're still coming out, I always tell parents to be like zombie parent, like hand on the shoulders, guide them back to their bed. No facial response, no talking, no interaction, very boring. For our younger kiddos who still have, like a good sense of imagination, you can use the sleep fairy. So the sleep fairy is your special friend who comes to visit kiddo only after they have gone to sleep. And if the child is asleep, the sleep fairy will leave them a little prize for the morning. Independent sleep can also be a really big challenge for our young kiddos. So this can show up in different ways. So a lot of times we'll have kids who take, again, forever to get to bed. These kids often have these curtain calls that we talked about. We'll also have kids who wake up a lot during the night. They might seek out parents, or our kids who know they are not to wake mom and dad will just like lay awake in bed for a really long time and can't go back to sleep. About 15 to 20% of preschoolers and school-age kids will have these problematic night wakings. Or we'll see that either kiddo co-sleeps or will try to co-sleep. Some factors that can contribute, probably the primary one is what we call sleep onset associations. So the idea behind this is that kids learn to fall asleep under certain conditions, right? Just like you and I learn to fall asleep in my bed with the light off. For me, I have to have my eye mask. And if those things are not there, like we cannot fall asleep. And that's true for kids too. And so if kids learn to fall asleep with mom or dad being in the room, they are going to wake up naturally during the night as part of their natural sleep cycle. And if that condition has changed, it's different, they're not going to be able to fall back asleep. Just like me, when I wake up and I can't find my eye mask, like I'm up and I'm looking for it until I can go back to bed. Kids are the same way. So they're going to seek out mom and dad to try to recreate that condition that they need. Basically, they like haven't learned the skill to fall asleep independently. And like I said, some night wakings are completely normal. What we want is for kiddo to know how to put themselves back to bed. And again, usually falling asleep can be challenging for kids, and then you might see some of these kind of stalling behaviors. And then some kids will have trouble with independent sleep because of nighttime fears or anxiety as well. I always think too, like if you have problems during the day, whether it's behavior or anxiety, just like assume that they're going to be worse at bedtime, right? Because none of us are our best selves. So if kiddo is struggling to manage fears and anxiety during the day, they are definitely going to struggle with it at night. So things that we can do to help support independent sleep. So we always talk as psychologists about something called extinction. This is the way we kind of eliminate a problem behavior. The problem behavior being coming out of your room, looking for caregivers. You guys have probably heard of Cry It Out or the Ferber method. That's really recommended for younger kids. This works super duper well. I don't usually recommend it because parents find it like completely intolerable. It's really, really hard to put in place. What I will typically recommend is something that we call graduated extinction, which is where we come up with a plan to sort of slowly move the parent out of the room. And we usually pair this with some of those like reinforcement things we talked about, like bedtime pass or a reward plan. In any of these, the most kind of important things you need to keep in mind is just to start at bedtime. So once kiddo learns how to fall asleep independently at bedtime, they will usually be able to figure out how to put themselves back to sleep when they wake up during the night. Also keeping kiddo's sleep location consistent. So we want the child to know that the only place they sleep is their own bed. So if we're still working on this, kiddo's still waking up during the night, it would be better to have parent go and sleep in their bedroom than let kiddo co-sleep that night. We want the child to really learn the only place they sleep is their own bed. And then probably first and foremost, honestly, meet your child where they're at and move gradually. It is better for this to take a long time and move really, really slow than it is to push them too hard. So this slide has a lot of words. I'm going to use the opportunity to take a quick drink. But there's kind of two systems that we can use to kind of move parents out of the room. So this first one is fading the parent out. So we're gonna start you wherever you are with your kid, right? So if your kid can't fall asleep without you literally in the bed with them, okay, that's where we're starting. If you're already in a place where you just kind of have to be in the room, we'll start there. So our goal is to consistently step parent back. So that might mean I'm sitting right in bed with you and I'm giving you kind of constant physical touch and reassurance and attention, to I'm just kind of gonna sit there, to I'm sitting in a chair next to the bed, to we're moving the chair out of the room, and so on. The goal with this, and with both of these systems really, is to always provide that parent attention and response before the kiddo has a chance to call out. Because if they call out and then you respond, what they've learned is to call out, right? So you want to kind of anticipate what they're going to do and offer that interaction more often than they need it. The system of checks works kind of the same way. You put kiddo in their bed and then you excuse yourself for a very brief moment. And for most parents, this means like you walk to the door and put your hand on the door handle before you turn around and say like, oh, Johnny, you did such a good job staying in your bed. Thank you so much for sitting quietly. I'm just gonna run out real quick. And then maybe this time you open the door a little bit and then you say, oh, you're doing such a good job laying in your bed, buddy. You're doing so good, right? So this is a little tedious, it takes a long time, but it really does work really well. So you wanna meet kiddo where they're at, provide that praise before they have a chance to call out. And like I said, once they're able to fall asleep independently at night, they're often able to put themselves back to bed when they have those night wakings too. But you can implement these procedures at night if you need to as well. For our nighttime fears, again, this will often present as taking a long time to get into bed. Those curtain calls coming out of the bedroom. Some of our kids will just lay awake in bed for a long time. And then I will often have kids who will sleep in weird places in the house. And when you ask them why they sleep there, they'll have some sort of rationale for why this spot is like better or safer or more comfortable for them. So I have lots of kids who will sleep in the living room because that's more centrally located in their house. They feel like if anything was happening, mom or dad could hear them. I had one kid who used to like to sleep in the room, like the dog's little sleep area, because they felt like if anything happened, the dog would wake up. So there's like a method to what they're thinking. Nighttime fears are really common. So in one study that was child report, 73% of kids between the ages of 4 and 12 said that they had some nighttime fears. So they're really common, and most kids can kind of manage them on their own, but sometimes they can present challenges. So what are some of the things that contribute to nighttime fears? Again, normal development, right? This is the most common bedtime problem for young kids. Young kids inherently have a hard time distinguishing fantasy from reality. Like we said, they start to have more of that kind of really good, solid imagination when they're younger. Especially for our kind of preschool 3 to 5 kids, they start to engage in more fantasy, more imaginative play, and they have a hard time kind of telling what's real and what's not. We tend to see so those types of kids will often have that age range, will often have fears like monsters, ghosts, things like that. Once you get out of that age range, kids get a little bit better at distinguishing fantasy from reality, and they will start to report more like realistic fears like burglars, natural disasters, fire, things like that. Again, contributing factor is anxiety. So if child has anxiety during the day, they're gonna have it at night. Similarly, if kids have trouble separating during the day, they can't really play independently on their own at the house, they can't separate for school, they're gonna struggle with this at night too. If you have kids that have like an underlying anxiety disorder or a behavior disorder, you really want to treat those daytime behaviors before we try to address some of this nighttime stuff, because again, everything's harder for everybody at night. So things you can do with your kiddo to help manage some of these fears. So the gold standard in psychology is something we call exposure with response prevention, which is a really fancy way of saying we're gonna expose kiddo to the thing that they're afraid of and we're not gonna let them run away from it. So we want to gradually and repeatedly expose a child to the scary thing, and at the same time, we want to pair this with something that's kind of fun or enjoyable. Over time, kiddo learns that the feared stimulus like really is not going to be harmful to them. It's almost like I tell kids like, we have to like reteach your brain. Your brain learned this really unhelpful thing and we need to help it learn something different. Again, just like we talked about before, you want to make sure this is gradual, start small, work up. You want to minimize any escape behaviors, so like attempts to avoid or get out of the situation. You want to end on a success. So if If the child becomes really, really escalated and scared and afraid, and then they get out of the situation, it's only natural that we're going to feel a sense of relief. And unfortunately, what happens when we feel that relief is that we learned that, okay, that thing actually was scary because when I left, I felt better, which is not what we want them to learn. So the way that this looks in practice, there are tons of different kind of fun exposure games that you can play. One of my favorite ones to do with kids is like a treasure hunt. So a flashlight treasure hunt. You hide a toy in the kid's bedroom, turn off all the lights, have the child use their flashlight to try to find the hidden toy, and then you make this harder over time. So once they have success with that, we're going to hide more toys, we're going to use harder hiding spots. I have families who will do things like shadow puppets and, you know, all kinds of different games. Basically anything that gets them in their room in some darkness can be a good source of exposure. Another one that I use often, especially for kids that have a hard time being alone during the day too, is something that I call brave points. The idea behind brave points is kids can earn points for engaging in brave behavior, so doing something that's scary. The harder the task is, the more points it's worth, and then they can turn those things in exchange for a prize or something that they enjoy doing. So this can be as simple as, you know, sitting down on the couch and telling them, okay, I need you to go to your room and grab a sweatshirt, I'll give you a brave point. Anything that gets them to go into that place by themselves on their own is going to help their kind of brain learn that, okay, when I go in my room by myself, nothing scary or awful or terrible happens. I'm probably going to be okay. There are also some good strategies we can use to just kind of help reduce anxiety. So different kind of stories that we can tell that help relax us. Huggy Puppy is like the gold standard in this area of research. The idea was, this was actually a study that was done with kids who had faced, who had been involved in war-torn areas, and they were given a stuffed animal and told that the animal was sad or scared and it needed someone to kind of take care of them or protect them. Or alternatively, you can tell them that the stuffed animal is their protector. And the data is really good to show that this really helps reduce fears. Kids sleep longer at night, something really simple you can do. Another one that parents often like is something called monster spray. So the idea is you just fill a spray bottle with water, you want to put a little lavender or whatever in it, label it monster spray, and then tell the child that, you know, the monsters are allergic to it, or it works like bug spray, like repellent, and then they can spray their room at night before bed. I put an asterisk here because for some of our kids, this one does not work. So it does in some ways inadvertently reinforce the idea that the monster is real and it is something we need to repel or keep away. And so for some of our particularly anxious kids, that's not going to work. So you have to know your child. But for some, it can be really helpful. And then lastly, there are tons of books and stories out there about kind of tackling fears and being brave, especially at bedtime. So those can be nice to read together, especially as like part of a bedtime routine. And then we can also do some other strategies to help calm ourselves down. So teaching deep breathing, muscle relaxation, again, a great thing to do as part of your bedtime routine. And then helping children change their thoughts. So this is something that we do in clinic all the time, teaching kids how to be the boss of their brain, or even doing what we call like changing the channel. So if a scary thought or image comes up in our mind, like we're literally going to think about changing the channel to something that makes us feel good and makes us feel happy. This sounds a lot easier to do than it actually is. It's good to practice with kids, come up with what they're going to have on their happy channel so that when they need to use it, it's really, really easy for them. Again, good bedtime routine stuff. So those are all some kind of easy, quick things that we can do at home. But I think it's important to say, you know, when should you talk to a provider? When should I ask my child's pediatrician about their sleep? So I think a good hallmark is anytime kids are having a lot of daytime sleepiness, even though they seem to be sleeping pretty well at night, they're having an adequate opportunity for sleep, they're getting kind of appropriate hours, and they're still really, really tired. Kids who have snoring or pauses in their breathing can be cause for concern with apnea, or if we have any odd or atypical or like rhythmic movements during sleep. Those are all things you would want to bring to your pediatrician. But also your pediatricians are there to answer questions. So really anytime you have a question or any sort of concern about sleep is always a good time to ask your pediatrician. So I just want to end on a couple resources. So this first one up here, the Autism Treatment Network Sleep Toolkit. It's on the Autism Speaks website. It's fabulous. It goes through honestly a lot of the things we talked today, somewhat through the lens of kids with autism, but honestly has helpful tips and tricks for any family. And then two books for parents that I love. So this first one by Jody Mindell, Sleeping Through the Night. This is more for our infants and young kids. This book is fabulous. I give this to all of my friends at their baby showers, regardless of what was on their registry. This is what you're getting from me. And it's honestly just such a good resource. And then Take Charge of Your Child's Sleep by Judy Owens and Jody Mandel is also a great one for kind of the more child and adolescent age range. And then some things for kids and parents. So we mentioned the Sleep Fairy. There's a cute little book that you can get on Amazon that walks through the story of the Sleep Fairy. You can like enter in your own bedtime routine, and you can read this together at night to help reinforce this kind of program. And then lastly, What to Do When You Dread Your Bed by Dawn Huebner, which is a workbook that kids can work through to kind of manage some of their fears, and it's told through this lens of like being a magician and learning these tricks. It's really cute. It helps them to practice exposure activities on their own. And I'll just give a plug. This is actually a series, the What to Do When series, all by Dawn Huebner. And so she has a bunch of really good evidence-based books like What to Do When Your Anger Flares, What to Do When You Worry Too Much, about all kinds of different topics. They're on Amazon. They're all like under $20. They're really good. So I will leave it at that. If anyone has any questions, you guys are all welcome to kind of contact me or reach out to your child's pediatrician. Always happy to talk more about sleep and how we can help our kiddos with sleep.